Our story begins with the foolish dreams of the young, dreams that would rival the founder Ignatius's in their audacity. In the wake of the French Revolution, the winds of religious revival were whipping through Europe, and 7 young seminarians from Belgium had been swept up in the current. They dreamed of bringing the gospel to the native peoples of America. Fueled by stories of the black robes of old, their imaginations told them that joining the Jesuits was the best way to pursue it. Beyond that, they had no plan.
7 young men, crazy in their young 20s. So without the knowledge of their parents, without the knowledge of almost anybody else, they sneak onto a ship coming to the United States, all of a sudden showing up at the novitiate in White Marsh, Maryland, saying, "We're here to convert the Indians." Well, the poor Americans there barely had enough food or money to take care of feeding the scholastics there. They didn't know quite what to do about this.
So the American Jesuits decided to send the would-be missionaries back home to Europe. Their dream dead on arrival. But at that very moment, the hand of Providence unexpectedly intervened. A request arrived from Bishop Louis de Bourgh of St. Louis, whose vast missionary diocese stretched from the Appalachians all the way to the Rockies. De Bourgh wanted Jesuits to open a school for Native American boys on property he had near St. Louis. So it was decided that the young Belgian recruits would go west under the charge of Father Charles Van Quickenborne, superior of the Maryland Jesuits. The agreement the Jesuits signed with Bishop de Bourgh specified that they would bring enslaved persons with them from Maryland to set up a farm to support the new mission. A sad historical reality that must be acknowledged, and only now are Jesuits beginning to address.
At that time, that would have been a matter of course. If you're going to have a farm, you need people to work it. The Jesuits are supposed to be free to do their missionary things. Of course, today, we look with horror that this could be part of an agreement.
So in 1823, 12 Jesuits and 3 enslaved couples set off on the long journey to St. Louis. They walked nearly 300 miles from White Marsh to Wheeling, West Virginia, and then embarked on a 500-mile journey down the Ohio River.
They knew nothing about river navigation, never been on a flatboat in their lives. They had some idea how to get to the place to be called St. Louis. That was their destination.
And so Father Van Quickenborne decided to buy 2 flatboats. You were supposed to have a pilot. The Ohio is very treacherous, but Father Van Quickenborne did not think such a luxury as a pilot was necessary. And instead, he bought a book called The Riverman's Guide on how to handle a flatboat. A Jesuit with a book can do just about anything.
And so by God's own grace, they successfully arrived in southern Illinois, where they disembarked to complete the final 120 miles of the trip on foot.
Believe it or not, this was the harder part of the trip because southern Illinois was completely swampy and malarial, and they even cut down branches to wave in front of their faces. The mosquitoes were so thick at all times of day.
Despite those punishing conditions, the travelers reached St. Louis in 10 days, arriving May 31st, 1823, the eve of the Feast of Corpus Christi. The town they found upon arrival was scarcely more than a trapping outpost, home to just a few thousand pioneering inhabitants. Bishop de Bourgh welcomed the Jesuits, then promptly put them to work leading the Corpus Christi procession through town the following day.
That's where we began as a missionary endeavor, fastened right away upon what was central, the Eucharist.
Bishop de Bourgh gave the Jesuits land just north of St. Louis in a hamlet called Florissant. Relying on labor of the enslaved couples, they began constructing their base of operations. They had an unusual model in mind.
They were very much aware of the previous generations, what are now called reductions in Paraguay, where the Jesuits went into literally the jungle, and there were native tribes there that they Christianized and taught to farm, settle down into towns. And so with this model in mind, they came to the farm at Florissant.
In Florissant, the Jesuits also opened the promised school for Native American boys. But after a few years of effort, they had managed to retain only 3 students, and the school was soon shuttered.
How Van Quickenborne or anybody thought you would get 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old Native American boys sitting down conjugating Latin verbs is beyond me.
Though the school was a failure, other efforts were beginning to bear fruit. Memories of the Jesuit black robes from 2 centuries earlier had perdured in Iroquois tribal legend, and now word was spreading that the famed priests had returned to St. Louis. Members of the Salish and Nez Perce tribes, the so-called Flatheads, sent delegations all the way from Montana to St. Louis, asking for black robes to come and live among them. After initially ignoring the requests, it was decided that one of the young Belgians would be sent to explore the feasibility of missions in the Pacific Northwest. His name was Peter de Smet.
The man who made Missouri Jesuits known everywhere was Father de Smet.
He is estimated to have traveled over 180,000 miles in his lifetime, all the way through what is now the Midwest, up to the Rockies, all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
One of the original 7 from Belgium, de Smet was short in stature and boundless in energy.
Deep winter nights, icy streams, very rugged terrain, often being the only white man who was in those areas, and more often still, the only white man who was trusted by the Native Americans. He was a friend to many of the tribes. Like most Jesuits, de Smet wrote letters describing the places he had been and the people he met.
We have probably 5,000 to 7,000 letters of Peter de Smet's in the collection. Provides a wonderful perspective into his thinking and the people who he's in touch with.
De Smet explored regions no European American had previously ventured. Along the way, he drew hundreds of detailed maps, priceless gems for future generations, which today are housed at the Jesuit archives in St. Louis.
This is one of Father de Smet's personal maps. Some are just simple sketches like this one, but some he added color to as well to denote settlements, monuments, rivers, forests. These maps represent some of the earliest exploration into the Pacific Northwest.
De Smet's maps were of such value that surveyors relied upon them to construct the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s. Other early Missouri missionaries left behind valuable historical artifacts too. Like Father Nicholas Point, an artist who documented Native American life on his extensive travels throughout the Pacific Northwest.
These drawings and watercolors are really historically valuable because they show life just before many Native American tribes were changed fundamentally by interactions with Europeans.
The color prints are some of my favorite in the collection. One in particular, Altar in Teepee, and it shows the mixing of cultures, both European culture and Native culture. The blessing of the arms before the chase, and it was a hunt. He recognized the value of that event in the life of Native peoples, and he was a part of it. Several drawings of tribal leaders. The pencil sketches are beautiful, simple but beautiful.
This was a tragic epoch for America's Native peoples as the U.S. government forced tribes to abandon their lands and way of life and settle on reservations in the West. The Jesuits, like Father de Smet, became important allies of the Native American cause.
De Smet, of course, is one of the great sources for the enculturation of Indians, struggling to help them keep their culture and at the same time defending them against the encroachments of American culture. Gained their trust so deeply that when the federal government asked for a representative from their tribes, they sent de Smet.
Despite de Smet's advocacy, America's Native peoples suffered one broken treaty and promise after another. The efforts of the first Missouri Jesuits may be remembered as the rare bright spot in an otherwise grievous period of the nation's history. The Jesuits had come to Missouri for the singular purpose of evangelizing native peoples. But quickly, a new, unplanned apostolate came to dominate their mission.
Overwhelmingly, the work of education was taken on because that's what people wanted. The bishops asked for that. The diocesan priests asked for people, as soon as they found out about the Jesuits, they wanted a Jesuit school.
In 1827, Bishop de Burgh asked the Jesuits to take control of a small school he'd founded in St. Louis a decade earlier. The Belgian Father Peter Verhagen was soon put in charge. He traveled to the Missouri State Legislature, where he managed to procure a university charter for the school. No small feat, considering the body was entirely Protestant. And thus, in 1832, St. Louis University was born.
First university west of the Mississippi. That is from the Mississippi River to California. The first law school, the first medical school, the first graduate school, the first one.
Running a university was not cheap. So in addition to raising funds for his missions to native peoples, Father Peter de Smet became the de facto director of development for St. Louis University.
One of the greatest fundraisers we have ever had. De Smet made, I believe, 9 voyages back to Europe at one time or another to collect money and to make known this school. He was a genius at that.
Demand for Jesuit education took off, and soon Jesuit schools were popping up throughout the Midwest and South, in places like New Orleans. French Jesuits had first arrived in New Orleans in 1726, just 8 years after the city's founding. They established a sprawling plantation that covered a large portion of what is today downtown New Orleans. Sadly, these Jesuits owned and relied on the labor of enslaved persons as they introduced a lucrative sugarcane farming industry to Louisiana. They used the proceeds to support missions to native tribes up and down the Mississippi.
There were 6 Jesuits who took off in pirogues up the Mississippi River. Some went to the Arkansas tribe, some to the Choctaw, some to the Yazoo, some to the Natchez. They all were very good linguists, so they learned the languages very, very quickly. And they would periodically come back to New Orleans, fill up with supplies, and go back. And that lasted until the suppression of the society.
In 1773, Pope Clement XIV bowed to political pressure and issued a papal brief dissolving the Society of Jesus worldwide. The Supreme Court of Louisiana quickly ratified the brief, expelling the Jesuits from Louisiana and confiscating their lands. Jesuits did not return to Louisiana again until some 60 years later, when the itinerant artist priest, Father Nicholas Point, landed in a village 150 miles west of New Orleans called Grand Coteau. Sisters of the Society of the Sacred Heart ran a convent school there, and Point agreed to serve as their chaplain. Soon after, he negotiated with the Bishop of New Orleans to obtain land and establish a Jesuit school nearby. St. Charles College of Grand Coteau opened its doors in 1838, and Jesuits from the Lyon province of France arrived to operate the place. From Grand Coteau, Jesuits then opened or took over schools in several other strategic cities: New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama in 1847, Bardstown, Kentucky in 1848, and Galveston, Texas in 1855. In a short time, the Missouri Mission had grown from 10 upstart Belgians to over 200 men. So in 1863, Rome decided to elevate Missouri to the status of a full-fledged province of the Society of Jesus. But there was a problem. The mission, with its frontier mentality, had never established an orderly program of training for new recruits.
When the first provincial was appointed to a full province, Father Ferdinand Kosemans, he wrote to Rome and said, "There's a mistake. I can't possibly be provincial." note the following. He said, in all my years in the Society of Jesus, I have had exactly 1 full uninterrupted year of training. Rome wrote back and effectively said, good try, but you're provincial.
As the Missouri province continued to expand, schools were its dominant focus. But in other far-flung places, Jesuits were busy building other ministries. Men like Father Alfred Lachelet, a recruit from Grand Coteau, who was sent to Georgia to train young Jesuits and do ministry with African American Catholics, then later on to Central Florida to plant parishes.
And in 1912, he took off for the hinterland. He, by himself, began to go into the part of Florida, south and east of Tampa, and it was really difficult stuff. Because he went where no one else was, he did the extremely hard job of finding Catholics who may not have been that actually happy to be found, and he gathered them into worshiping communities. And finally, when he was retired to Tampa, he turned over 13 established parishes to the Bishop of Tampa, which was really quite amazing.
Then there was Father Albert Beaver. In 1897, Father Beaver arrived in New Orleans to serve as a parish priest and a teacher at the Jesuit high school. Then, as the lore goes, the provincial gave him a nickel's streetcar fare and sent him uptown with instructions to start a college. Loyola New Orleans was chartered as a university a few years later. One of Father Beaver's confreres, Father Oral Aby, pioneered in another way. Recognizing the potential of a new mass communications medium, Aby opened Louisiana's very first radio station at Loyola University in 1922. WWL became one of the South's most important broadcasters for the next half-century. Meanwhile, after establishing the university, Father Beaver took on a side job with a roving group of Jesuits called the Mission Band. Based in Selma, Alabama, because of its expansive railroad connections, they visited towns across the South, directing retreats and preaching missions. During this time, a wave of anti-Catholicism was flooding the South, and the Mission Band found itself frequently harassed by the Ku Klux Klan. But they were determined and used everything at their disposal to find an audience, including, in Father Beaver's case, his training as a high school chemistry teacher.
Now this is in the South, not a whole lot of Catholics throughout Alabama and Georgia and those places. So to attract people, he would bring out his chemicals and go into the town square and make explosions, make fireworks, that sort of thing, and that attracted people's attention, and then he would begin to tell them about Jesus. Later in his life, he felt that that was his, not the founding of Loyola University, but that was his greatest ministry.
I think that really is who the Society of Jesus was in the South, in the service of the Word. We did sacraments, of course, but we primarily were talkers, and the topic always was the gospel.
As Jesuits like Beaver and Lachelet were building the church in the southeast, other Jesuits were venturing into the American Southwest to serve a much older Catholic population. Jesuits arrived in New Mexico in 1867 at the request of Santa Fe's first archbishop, the Frenchman Jean-Baptiste Lamy. The faith they found was a unique blend of Mexican and indigenous Catholicism dating from the time of the earliest Spanish missionaries. So the Jesuits built upon what was already there, preaching missions and building parishes in growing population centers like Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and El Paso. Many of these missionaries were Italians, exiled from home during the turbulent period of Italian reunification. In Albuquerque, Father Donato Gaspari became pastor of San Felipe de Neri Church. He also set up the nation's first Spanish-language Catholic printing press, printing Bibles and textbooks, and a popular newspaper called Revista Católica that featured not only devotional articles, but Jesuit recipes, stories in cereal, and cultural items. In El Paso, the Italian Father Carlos Pinto arrived in 1893 and immediately set to work building a church and school for poor Mexican children in the city's Segundo Barrio, along with 2 other parishes on both sides of the U.S.-Mexican border. In the wake of the 1910 Mexican Revolution, refugees came flooding across the border into the U.S. with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. These Italian Jesuits, refugees themselves, understood the hardships endured by their flock and responded energetically.
The Jesuits on the border helped receive the refugees. Things like soup kitchens were very important, educational services, etc., but religious services also.
The Italian Jesuits also had a passion for the arts and a genius for recognizing the key role culture played in making their flocks feel welcome in a nation that was frequently hostile to them.
It's very interesting that a lot of it was through culture. Telling them, okay, maybe you're being told that you are these barefooted, ignorant Mexicans who bring nothing to this country, but you know much better.
Father Pinto's confrere, Father Carmelo Tranchese, even brought the opera to his El Paso parishioners.
Carmelo Tranchese loves opera, very energetic. So here he is, he builds a school in El Paso for 1,000 kids. These are Mexican kids in the poor part of town. And after they built the newer church, he turned the old church building into an opera house. And he painted sets. So here are these people in El Segundo Barrio in El Paso, among the poorest in the country, and yet they're singing opera.
After completing his term in El Paso, Father Tranchese was assigned to San Antonio, where he built a church on the city's slum-filled west side and became a fierce advocate for his destitute Mexican-American flock. In 1938, he supported pecan workers in a strike to increase their wages. He also befriended Eleanor Roosevelt, whose assistance he relied upon to open one of the nation's very first public housing developments. In the wake of the Mexican Revolution, Jesuits also established a seminary to train diocesan seminarians exiled from Mexico. Housed in an old hotel in Las Vegas, New Mexico, the Montezuma Seminary trained some 9,000 priests and 25 future bishops before it was closed in the 1970s. Meanwhile, back in St. Louis, since the Missouri province was no longer mission territory, but a full-fledged Jesuit province, the Superior General in Rome asked it to take on a mission of its own and selected the small Caribbean nation then known as British Honduras, today Belize. The Missouri Jesuits arrived in Belize in 1894 and took over a fledgling mission established by British Jesuits 4 decades earlier. The English had built the Belizean church from ground up, establishing numerous parishes and schools along the coastal areas of the tropical nation. The new arrivals from Missouri picked up where the English had left off, serving Catholics from Belize's diverse Creole, Mestizo, Maya, and Garifuna populations. The Missouri Jesuits also built a stately new campus for St. John's College, then the most important Jesuit school in all of Central America, educating boys from elite families of numerous Latin American countries. Tragically, a hurricane razed the school in 1931 and claimed the lives of 18 students and 11 Jesuits. But St. John's was rebuilt in a new location where it continues today, educating the great majority of Belize's leaders in politics, business, and other sectors. Through the years, Missouri Jesuits contributed to the building of Belizean society in other ways, too. Father John Mark Jacoby brought scouting to Belize. Fathers Marion Gainey and Henry Suddy introduced the credit union movement at a time when ordinary Belizeans had no access to banking. In the political realm, Jesuits became important advisors to Belize's independence movement, even helping to draft the nation's constitution, when it achieved independence from Britain in 1981. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, the island of Puerto Rico first saw Jesuits in the 16th and 17th centuries, when missionaries en route to other destinations would stop on the island to give retreats and missions. But it wasn't until the 1850s that Jesuits from Spain came to establish a permanent presence on the island. They took over the diocesan seminary and founded a boys' school, the Colegio San Ignacio. In the 1880s, the Spanish Jesuits decided to leave Puerto Rico to concentrate their resources in Peru. Jesuits returned again to the island in the 1940s, this time from Cuba, and have remained ever since, operating the Colegio San Ignacio and a retreat house, teaching in universities, and engaging in a wide range of missionary activities.
Por eso es que en esta isla, ¿qué necesitaba la iglesia en el año 1945? Pues retiros espirituales, o sea, fomentar más la vida espiritual que no había. Era simplemente el apostolado de las parroquias, ir a la misa, etc. Y el obispo pidió, tenía buena idea, pidió a los jesuitas, porque los jesuitas saben de ejercicios espirituales, pidió por ahí. Pero después los jesuitas dijeron, nosotros tenemos gente preparada intelectualmente, doctores tenemos aquí, pues vamos a la clase que dirige este país, que es la Universidad de Puerto Rico.
Prominent among Puerto Rican Jesuits was Antulio Parilla Bonilla. In 1965, Parilla became a bishop, and after serving several years as rector of the diocesan seminary, he became a fierce champion of social justice and the rights of the poor. Parilla also helped birth Puerto Rico's cooperative movement. Today, his cause for canonization is underway. The past decade has been one of dramatic change for Jesuits in Puerto Rico and in the South and Central United States. In 2014, Puerto Rico joined with the old Missouri and New Orleans provinces in forming the new Central and Southern Province. A culturally and linguistically diverse province, it aims to be a bridge connecting North and South America by focusing on issues that affect the entire hemisphere, like migration. The faces of the Jesuits who composed the province have changed too. Their origins are Latin American and Vietnamese, the Philippines, and the Caribbean. The pioneering Jesuits who came before us help us imagine our future. They were bold, braving harsh Rocky Mountain winters and sweltering tropical summers to share the good news.
What impresses me most about the 19th century Jesuits is their willingness to leave home, to take risks, to go and work with people on the margins. They were on the margins of what was then the United States, and they were willing to say yes to things that were difficult.
How this place was founded, it was founded by a group of enterprising young missionary entrepreneurs who wanted to spread the gospel, convert people to the faith. The society does not lack holy men or illustrious, educated men. But what it needs more than anything else is imaginative people to see what nobody else had seen, opportunities to spread the gospel. That was those young men who first came here.
2 centuries ago, when those young Belgians began their journey, they hardly could have imagined the harvest the seeds they planted would bear. Countless Jesuits and lay colleagues have followed in their footsteps, each sharing their unique gifts in building the kingdom in each time and place. Where the next 200 years and beyond will take us, we can scarcely imagine. But if we proceed with the boldness and imagination of those who came before us, always rooted in Christ, the harvest will surely be bountiful.